on all seriousness. In the Roman Empire, there was one question that impacted each person's life in a profound way, and that question was this: are you a citizen of Rome? The vast majority of people were not. A privileged few could probably say, yes, I am a citizen, and enjoy the benefits and the protection that that citizenship afforded. As we know, the Apostle Paul was a citizen of Rome. It was that citizenship by which he appealed to Caesar, and for which now he is in Rome, in prison, awaiting his trial. The people of Philippi, to which he was writing, were largely retired military veterans and their descendants who had been settled as their pension in and around the city of Philippi. And so most of them had that also, that honor of being Roman citizens, that honor that was certainly rare in the ancient world. So as we look at these verses and talk about citizenship, consider Roman citizenship and what it meant to both Paul and the people of Philippi. So let's begin in verses 15 and 16 of chapter 3. It says this: all of us who are mature should take such a view of things, and if on some point you think differently, that too God will make clear to you. Only let us live up to what we have already attained. Paul says all of us who are mature should take such a view. Now that is connected to what he said previously. Previously, Paul made it clear that perfection is not possible in this life, but that the pursuit of ever-increasing Christ-likeness is our goal just the same. It is an attitude of realistic dedication that focuses on moving forward and fulfilling our purpose for which God has called us. Those who are mature in their faith will recognize two things: both the impossibility of perfection, and secondly, the necessity of doing our best anyway. Well, the immature believer is going to have more zeal than wisdom. And the immature believer may insist that they can be perfect and look down upon those who say otherwise as being slackers or not dedicated enough. So perhaps the immature believer won't recognize that first truth. Or they may go the other way. The immature believer may see the great gap between themselves and what they know about Christ and become discouraged and think, this is hopeless, I'll never get anywhere near him, I might as well give up. You see, it takes maturity to admit that something is impossible without giving up trying anyway. So Paul says, God will make that clear to you. He didn't feel the need to argue with those who failed to see what to him was obvious. He instead trusted that God would make it clear to them over time. I think that actually is a mark of maturity on Paul's part. He no longer feels the need, as he did when he was a zealous young man, to have everybody agree with him about everything. You see, picking your battles may to the young seem not overly courageous, but to those who have wisdom, they see the truth of that. You cannot fight every battle all the time. Eventually, those who cling to a perfectionist view will see the truth in their own failures and be forced to admit it. And eventually, those who despair of making progress will see the truth in the success of others. And they too will admit in the end the truth that Paul is speaking of. He says, instead of worrying about that, let us live to what we have already attained. Because Paul lives and works for God in the real world, living with his own flaws and that he knew all too well. His mind is not wandering toward unattainable perfection, but is instead rooted in the awesome responsibility that God had already given to him. I think too often Christians get sidetracked, looking for mountaintop experiences, seeking out miracles or visions, when the work that God has called us to is already all around us. Let us first be worthy of where God has placed us. Then, when we have fulfilled those obligations, then God can entrust us with greater things. In addition to serving God where we are, we must also be aware of the pitfalls that could damage our testimony as individuals and our testimony as a church. What good will What good will it do the gospel if we plant seeds, only to later go back and pull up the tender shoots through our own immorality? That does no one any good. I was struck when Don Piper was here. He talked about seeing all the people at the gates of heaven who had assisted him, who had helped him build his relationship with Christ throughout the years. It was a heartwarming reminder that even small contributions that we might discount can have a lasting impact. But his saying that, I think, begs another question. Is not the opposite also true? Are there not a group of people who have kept this person or that person away from the gospel? A group of people who by their unloving and unkind actions have driven people away from God. If there are Christians standing in that crowd of shame for any individual, they will be there because they failed to take action when someone needed help, or because they let immorality destroy their trustworthiness. You see, we must first live up to the calling to be effective witnesses for the gospel. Paul continues in verse 17 and says this, "Join with others in following my example, brothers, and take note of those who live according to the pattern we gave you." Paul knew that if he was going to encourage people to follow his example, he would have to set an example that was worth being followed. That's a day-to-day commitment on his part to not only follow Jesus, but to avoid temptation. Now, we all know of famous examples of people who have destroyed their ministries, primarily through their sexual immorality or through their greed. But beyond those headlines are far too many ordinary people who have ruined their witness by putting their own self-indulgence above their service to God. So in light of that, it helps us to look up to our heroes and consider them, to look back on people like Paul and think about his life, or to look amongst those who are living today at heroes, people that we all regard highly like Billy Graham, and say, this is someone I can look up to. Yet Paul reminds us that we don't need to look to someone famous to find a hero of the faith. He encouraged the people of Philippi to look around them, at those who were demonstrating Christian commitment and maturity within their own church. So I encourage you this morning to do the same thing. There are examples here in this church of patience and perseverance, if that's what you need to be comforted. There are examples here in this church of service and self-sacrifice, if you need to be encouraged to do the same. And there are examples of marital fidelity and honoring marriage, if that's what you need to be encouraged by. And there are examples of loving parenting, if that's what you need. No, I don't say these things to puff anyone sitting here up to saying, yeah, I'm the example. That's not the point at all. I say this in all sincerity, because there are those amongst us who may be struggling, or who might be struggling in the future. There is someone here among you who knows what you are going through because they have been there before. They would be happy to help you. If you express to them your need, they would love a chance to mentor you and help you because they went through it first. But we certainly won't be able to do that if we can't speak honestly about our victories and about our defeats so that we know where we stand. If you read a book by a famous author, it might be helpful to you. It might say some stuff that you really need. But don't neglect the wisdom and the experience that God has put here in this church. That others of us have been where you may be right now is not a coincidence. That is the wisdom of God by bringing people here that can help you. Paul goes on not to talk about those that are helpful, but those that are hurtful. Verses 18 and 19, he says, "For as I have often told you before, and now say again, even with tears, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their destiny is destruction, their God is their stomach, and their glory is in their shame. Their mind is on earthly things. For Paul, this was a truth that brought him to tears to think about. At the same time that he's encouraging the people of Philippi to live their lives in imitation of Christ, to follow his example and the example of mature believers around them, he cannot at that same time ignore one disheartening truth, that there will always be some people who choose to oppose the work of God. Even a casual reading of the Bible will uncover a variety of antagonists. People who either were part of God's people or were not. People who were either at the top of society or at the bottom, but who were nonetheless actively fighting against God. No, Paul doesn't need anyone to tell him that such people exist. He used to be one before God opened his eyes. And now people, like he used to be, have opposed his ministry every step of the way. Throughout each of his attempts to bring hope to the hopeless, they have opposed him. And even now, as Paul sits in prison, they are working to try to make sure that this imprisonment is either permanent or fatal to Paul. One of the most difficult truths to come to grips with when working on God's behalf, no matter what particular ministry it might be, is that there will always be those who will set fire to another person's good work just to watch it burn. I have that same senseless feeling, and you probably do as well. Anytime you see rioters on TV destroying the neighborhood that they live in, looting the business people who have been working in their community because they have let their rage blind them to who they are hurting. That same truth exists in our world. There are people who will destroy what you or I or the church has tried to do simply for the sake of destroying it. Self-inflicted and senseless wrongs and evils are a truth that we have to come to grips with if we are ever to effectively fight against it. Even if, like Paul, it brings us to tears to think about them. Paul says that such people, their destiny is destruction. Part of the reason for Paul's sadness is that in addition to the work of God that was being harmed or destroyed by those who opposed the cross, there is an additional tragedy. That these men and women who are fighting against God are doomed one day to experience their own destruction as well. They were not simply destroying God's work, they were destroying themselves in the process. When we see those who would harm the work of the gospel, those who would oppose people who are only trying to help their fellow man in his dire need, it first usually moves us to anger when we see that. And rightly so, we should be angry. After all, Jesus was angry when he stood in the temple and confronted the self-righteous. He was angry in the temple when he confronted the corrupt moneylenders. Righteous anger is an emotion that God expresses throughout the Bible. But we have to continue beyond anger. We must, like God, be moved in the end by compassion, until we feel that same profound sadness that God feels as a parent who is unable to stop their child from self-destructing. Now, if I think on my own life, the rare times that I get really angry, I'm not a person who feels anger very often. But when I do, it is when I see the strong picking on the weak. That really makes me upset. Afterwards, though, experience has taught me, and working with the troubled kids that I did for 10 years has taught me, that pity is where I must eventually be, because the lives of these people that are hurting others will themselves only end in destruction. They don't know God's love. That is why they are acting this way. Paul says that their God is their stomach, their glory is in their shame, their mind is on earthly things. There are many cautionary tales from people both famous and people we've known in our own lives that tell us that a life lived in pursuit of self-centered goals will only prove hollow in the end. Here Paul explains in more detail the reasons why these enemies of the cross of Christ are destined for destruction if they don't find God's redemption before it is too late. Think about this. In our own lives, we have seen that today's concerns and today's needs can overwhelm us to the point that we cannot see beyond our lives to the things of God. If that can happen to us, to those of us who know the grace of God, and who are, and even with that grace, are at times worn down by the concerns of life, imagine how difficult it must be for people who know nothing of spiritual things, who know nothing of God's love and grace. Imagine how difficult it must be for them to grasp that physical things like hunger and needs and wants cannot be all there is to this life. Your stomach is always going to grumble, but shouldn't there be more to life than satisfying it? For many who don't know God's purpose in their lives, the only escape they can find from that mundane existence are the thrills of depravity and degradation. Whether it be sexual promiscuity or experimentation, substance abuse, gambling, or simply rebellion for the sake of rebellion, none of these paths will end well. All of them will end in shame. Now, shame may not be popular in our culture today. Taboos may be weaker than they've been in a long time. But perversion of the noble purpose for which God intended each of us will always fail to satisfy and will always have consequences. And yet people that you talk to may counter that argument and say, what's the big deal about focusing on myself? It's my life, isn't it? Why shouldn't I live my life the way I want to? My answer to that is simply, if life was only here and now, if God did not exist, if there was no life after death, and certainly no final judgment, if we truly lived in a survival of the fittest, dog-eat-dog world, then there would be nothing anyone could say against your living your life entirely for yourself. Well, that was a lot of ifs. Here's one more. What if God is real, and your life really is not your own to do with as you please? What will you do then? Paul finishes in verses 20 and 21 with this. He says, "But our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await a Savior from there, the Lord Jesus Christ, who by the power that enables him to bring everything under his control will transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body." Paul says, but our citizenship is in heaven. A lot of people don't understand Christians, do they? Why do we do what we do? It's a mystery to them. And this simple statement explains why they will not be able to comprehend those that follow Jesus. We're foreigners to them. We're foreigners. You might have been born in the same town. You might have attended the same school. You might even have hung out together. But because I'm a disciple of Jesus Christ, I have more in common with a fellow believer from Zimbabwe or Thailand that I will never meet in my life than I do with my next door neighbor who does not know Jesus Christ. Now, before you or I despair of ever being understood or fitting in the culture in which we live, let me suggest two simple things to help with that. First off, hang out with God's people. That's where you will be understood. That's where you will feel like you fit in. And secondly, do something about it. Share your relationship with Christ with those who need to know him. But what does heavenly citizenship mean for us? Paul said our citizenship is in heaven. What does that mean? It means that our passport, as it were, is already stamped for admittance into heaven. The greatest question of our lives, where will we spend the afterlife, has already been answered. But if we stop there and think that heavenly citizenship is only something for after we're dead and gone, will have wasted so much of God's grace for our lives now. Heaven is for then, but it had better also be for now. To be a citizen of heaven is to supersede all other allegiances and oaths. It is to let go of what was corrupted in your past and embrace what God is doing within you both today and in the future. To the Philippians, citizenship in heaven was more important than being Roman citizens. And to us here this morning, it is more important than your American citizenship. That Paul knew that he was a citizen of heaven explains so much about his life that he talked about in chapter 3. Why was Paul able to look back on his life before Christ and consider it all to have been rubbish? Because his citizenship is in heaven. Why was Paul able to lose things in life, even put his own life on the line for the sake of the gospel without regretting it? Because his citizenship was in heaven. Why was Paul consumed with passion to consider and to continue the process of becoming Christ-like, even while he was admitting that he would never really get there? Because his citizenship is in heaven. So in practical terms, where does that leave us? Step one, we need to be sure that our citizenship is in heaven. The question then is how? It's easy. Put your faith in the forgiveness of God through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Let go of your past and let God have your future. That's all it takes. Step two, we need to start looking at the world around us through God's eyes. And I'm not saying something mystical or magical that we suddenly see things like that. We can step back, though, from life and ask ourselves these questions. What really matters here? What should be important in my life? Where is the goodness and light that I might embrace? And where is the darkness of evil that I might shun it and fight against it? And then lastly, who is God seeing that I'm looking past? And why is that? We need to ask those kinds of questions and see the world through the eyes of God, because we are citizens of heaven. If we are going to live as citizens, we need to open our eyes and see this world as it truly is. Third step, if you are a citizen of heaven, you need to live today for eternity. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to be serious all the time and we can't enjoy ourselves and have fun. And it certainly doesn't mean that we can't relax or take vacations. But it does mean that the consequences of the choices that we make in our lives here and now, both big choices and small ones, will echo through eternity. Like ripples in a pond, how we choose to live today will not only affect your future, but countless people around you. So in the end, only the things that we do in life in service to God, by helping our fellow man, will stand the test of time. A true citizen of heaven lives in service to his family, to his church, and to his community. And I also mean her in each of those. Her family, her church, her community. Paul says we eagerly await a Savior from there. There's an ongoing discussion and debate even within the church. If you look back in church history, it goes all the way back to the beginning, about how we should relate to this world as a people who belong to the next. Some people think we should try to transform the world, knowing that we won't succeed in the same way that we strive to transform ourselves, even though we won't succeed. Others have said, no, this world is doomed. We must withdraw from it. Let the world be what it is. Let's focus on eternity, on perfecting the church. Along those same lines, some people have said you can expect that the world will only get worse before the return of Christ. And others have said, no, the world is going to get better before Christ can return. So some of us look at the world around us and say, it's going this way anyway. And others look at that same world and say, we must fight for it. Those two ideas exist within Christianity, and neither of them are going away. That both viewpoints have been popular and still are today doesn't make it any easier for us to understand what the true perspective and attitude is supposed to be. But let me tell you this, regardless of which attitude turns out to be the right one, if this world is bound for destruction before Christ returns, or if this world will only get better until he comes to reign triumphantly, our responsibility is the same, exactly the same, no matter what. We must serve God here and now. If Jesus decides to return to finish the job and stop us in the midst of our work, then fine, we'll celebrate. But if he does not, we will still have earned the reward of a faithful servant by being diligent. Paul talks about when Christ will bring everything under his control. We know from chapter 2 that one day every knee should bow and every tongue confess the lordship of Christ. And we know that Jesus will rule here on earth, no matter which side is right, no matter what kind of world Christ finds when he comes back, he will rule. And he will one day begin the final reconciliation of all things in creation with their Creator. But until that day, God's people here on earth will remain strangers living in a foreign land, will remain pilgrims journeying to a distant home whose true citizenship is in heaven. Paul finishes in talking about our bodies, that they will one day be like his glorious body. See, all this talk about the whole world, the future of the world, might make us think that God's not all that concerned about little old you or me, but that's far from the truth. As the adopted children of God, the flesh that you are inhabiting today is not good enough for the kingdom of God. It will one day be transformed. It will be renewed. It will be perfected. Look at the world around you. See it through God's eyes as a world of lost people full of despair. Look at your body. See it through the eyes of God. It was his highest act of creation, now marred by disease and age and sin. So we eagerly await the transformation of our world into the paradise that it was before the fall. And we eagerly await the transformation of our own bodies into the perfection that was given to humanity before the fall. God will accomplish all of this because our hope, our faith rests upon these promises, for our citizenship is in heaven.